One of the best parts of a Fire Emblem game is recruiting new and fun characters into your ever-growing army, and sometimes the game even gives multiple characters at the same time. Not only giving more characters to experiment with, but also giving a better chance that you'll recruit someone great for your army. But what about the times when that doesn't happen? When the game whiffs on two or more characters at the exact same time? Well, that's what we're here to discuss today. I want to talk about the worst group recruit in Fire Emblem history, a chapter in Fire Emblem 6, where the best unit recruited is still well below average in the game. Welcome to Fire Emblem 6 Chapter 8. You just beat the dreaded Chapter 7, which is arguably the most brutal chapter in the entire game, and thankfully, Chapter 8 is one of the easiest. You may have even lost some units getting through Chapter 7 and would love some strong replacements to start training. You start the chapter and immediately recruit Lina, a level 1 mage whose decent class is about the best thing you can say about her. I don't include Lina in the group recruit on this chapter. I only mention her because despite being a pretty mediocre to bad unit, she is way better than the losers we are about to talk about. After progressing through the chapter a little ways, our terrible trio shows up, ready to help break their princess out and help the Lycian army. Just one little problem. They all suck ass. So what makes these three so bad? Let's start with the most okay-ish of the three, OJ. OJ is not the worst unit in the game, which is actually a pretty big compliment considering the rest of the crew he's with. He's even a solid class. He's a mercenary. We already have a mercenary in our army in Deke, who's probably done some really good work for you up until this point. So is this new OJ guy comparable to him? Well, other than luck, all of OJ's bases are worse than Deke's, and Deke was recruited on Chapter 2. Boasting 24 HP and 4 defense, his bulk is terrible, making it really hard for him to have an impact, especially on the front lines. But don't worry, because he also sucks offensively. With 7 base strength and being sword locked, his damage is really bad, and 9 speed is not enough to double most things, even at this stage in the game. Or at least not the things you'd want him to fight. Obviously he can double armors, but he's not going to be able to do very much. He does come with an armor slayer, which is usable by him, which is pretty cool. But honestly, that armor slayer is much more useful on other better units, like for example, Deke. It's not all bad for OJ though, because despite being terrible on recruit, he actually scales into a pretty decent unit. As I said before, mercenary slash hero, which is what he promotes into, is a pretty solid class. Also, his growths are pretty good. He averages over 40 HP, 16 strength, 18 speed, and even 11 defense on promotion if you promote him at level 20. Mostly that's due to the 4 bonus promotion gain defense on mercenary slash hero, which is actually really good. That's a pretty strong unit. He has the added benefit of being pretty easy to train once you get to the Western Isles, which is right after where he's recruited. This does not make OJ an exceptional unit in the game. Let's be clear about that. Far from it. But at least there is some potential here, and it's not insane to try and tap it, which is way more that can be said for his 2 companions. Next up, let's talk about Barth, a unit who actually may look kind of okay on first appearance, but don't let that fool you. He is terrible. Barth is a very generic knight. He has solid HP, strength, and really good defense. Unfortunately, Barth is already a pretty terrible unit because of his class. Knights are some of the worst classes in the GBA games because they lack the movement to keep up with other units, especially cavalry. Offensively, Barth seems like he can hit pretty hard, even if he can't double. Well, units in this game have pretty high stats, meaning his damage is pretty low on most enemies. But high stats also mean some decent avoid for the enemies. Coupled with the low hit rates of lances in this game, it's hard for him to even connect on attacks most of the time. And it's not like Weapon Triangle is really his friend either, as most sword users are mercenaries, and my man is not seeing over 50% hit on those guys. But it gets even worse because while OJ and his swords do great work in the Western Isles, which is right after you recruit this crew, Barth and his lances are nearly useless there. So he sucks offensively, but at least he's a brick wall, right? Well, more of like a strong cardboard wall, really? Maybe? Because while 25 HP and 14 defense may seem like it goes a long way, it can only go so far. Again, enemies have really high stats in this game. So 14 defense is nowhere near enough for enemies to deal 0 damage. And when everyone doubles you, that damage adds up really fast. And that isn't even to mention things like mages that will obliterate Barth. He does have good HP, strength, and defense growths, but because his damage and hit are very mediocre, it's really hard to train him honestly at all. So the combination of a bad class, mediocre to bad, both bases and growths, make him one of the worst units in the game, and yet Barth is still infinitely better than the last unit in this crew. And finally we get to Wendy, who is the worst character in the entire game. Wendy has all the same problems as Barth, with a terrible class and being terrible during the next section of the game, but she also lacks his decent bases. Wendy also gets doubled by everything with only 3 base speed, but she also lacks the bulk to take any hits under any circumstances ever. Wendy's a growth unit with extremely mediocre growth. But even if they were good and you discounted the weak bases, it is so difficult to find her kills. Not necessarily because she can't attack anything that attacks back, or even so much because her damage is putrid, although obviously those two things do not help her. But because 3 skill with lances at this stage in the game just will not give you over 50% hit on basically any enemy under any circumstances. It's like Barth's problem, but a little bit worse, you know? So even if you set up kills for her, unless it's like archers where she can really take her time with it, she will very likely miss them. And this is coming from someone who's trained both Wendy and Barth alongside boars to triangle attack everything. And my advice is just don't do it. Don't do it. So let's recap the units Fire Emblem offers to replenish your army after the nightmare that is Chapter 7. We have OJ, who is much worse than a unit you recruited 6 chapters earlier. Barth, who has some very specific niches maybe, but overall is a terrible class with mediocre bases and growths. And finally Wendy, who is one of the worst characters probably in Fire Emblem history, if we're being honest, with all the same problems as Barth without any of the very small upside. Thank you, Fire Emblem 6. Very cool.